Welcome back to The Narrative. I'm your storyteller, Calistro Faria. Violence against women and girls remains one of the most prevalent and pervasive human rights violations in the world. And despite many countries passing laws to combat violence against women, weak enforcement and discriminatory social norms remain significant problems. And whether or not we're investing sufficiently in programs that will enable women and empower women so that they can get themselves out of difficult situations. And that's specific to gender-based violence against women. Of course, you have gender-based violence against men as well. Joining me on the program now is consultant ALANA Wheeler. She is a former head of Trinidad's anti-trafficking unit, and she focuses a lot on the empowerment of women and gender-based violence. And she's joining me now to talk about the issue as we observe 16 days of activism, the UN program, where from November 25 to December 10, 16 days of activism is observed in order to try to bring awareness to and to try to decrease and finally eradicate the issue of gender-based violence. Welcome to the program, Ms. Wheeler.
Good. Thank you, Calistro, for having me on the program. It's always good to be on your program and talking with another island in the Caribbean.
And it's good to have you on. Now, the issue of gender-based violence, one of the things when I interview people a lot is the economics behind it, the lack of economic empowerment in a lot of cases that puts women at risk, either in abusive relationships or in the case of an area that I know you focus on, which is human smuggling and illegal migration and that sort of thing, which then puts women into vulnerable positions when they're being moved to countries that are not theirs. Do we need to focus more, and I know it's a theme as well for this the activism outreach this year, in terms of investment, what should governments be doing more and better to try to focus in on that aspect of the problem?
Yeah. Well, what I have to say is that a lot of investment has been made over the years, particularly in the region, the Caribbean region. Of course, there's always more that can be done. But, governments are always faced with priorities. What are their financial priorities for every budget year? So it's always important, though, to invest in the people because, the Bible says without a vision, the people perish, but without people, the vision would perish. So we need people and we need persons who can function effectively in our society. So you have had some investments being made by the various governments. One of the big projects I think is coming to an end this year, I think this month, is the Spotlight Initiative, which I know there is a project like that in Grenada. It's operating in Trinidad, Grenada, Guyana, Belize, Haiti, and a few of the other Caribbean countries, right? So that project has done a lot of work. It's actually one of the largest investments that has been made by the European Union and the UN to invest in treating with violence against women and girls. We focus on violence and against women and girls, but really it should be women and children because they are the most vulnerable in our society, and when we hear violence against women and girls, we automatically think of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, but it expands even to trafficking in persons. Trafficking in persons is a type of violence against women and girls. And when you look at these statistics from the UNODC says that 10, right, out of every 10 victims that are detected and victims of trafficking, 5 are women and 2 are girls. So we see where the data is skewed. So investments have been made. I think we also tend to look at just the economic challenges and the economic vulnerabilities, but there are also other vulnerabilities that women and children have. And sometimes it can be simply an emotional attachment to the person. It's not just financial, it's emotional, it can be physical. There can be the issue of there are children in this relationship. Or so how am I going to now navigate to walk away from this relationship? I have to consider the children that are in this relationship. So there are so many dynamics, so many elements to consider when we are looking at violence against women and girls. I also want to talk about how men objectify and control women and girls' bodies. And there is also that cultural issue, particularly in our Caribbean region. How do we define who is a man? How do we define what masculinity is? And there are some cultures where masculinity means beating the woman to keep her under control. There are some
But
cultures
but
where
but but
masculinity.
but you know, let me jump in here to say that, and I was speaking with one of our producers just earlier about this, where I grew up in a community where women had this saying, if your man don't beat you, he don't love you. So I grew up hearing the cries of women from a place that we call the dry wall. There was a spot where they would bring them to beat them,
Yes,
and then
yes,
they would go ahead and be intimate with them, and they
yes.
felt like this was some sort of expression of love. So you find that
Love.
women are also enablers of their own oppression.
Yes. Well, that is it's a cultural norm, that's a cultural norm in our society in the Caribbean and in some other cultures also, where the men play this dominant, controlling role over the woman and over her sexuality. So he can freely beat her, and then when he wants sex or when he wants intimacy, physical intimacy, he can just have it when he wants it because that's how we objectify women. It doesn't make it right in any way at all, because we are all entitled to rights. This is why I think the 16 days of activism cultivates in the Human Rights Day on the 10th of December, because the violence against women and girls is linked to human rights.
And how do we, I think sometimes women, we feel, some women feel like they're the weaker part of the equation. So they have to stay because of the kids. They have to stay because they're getting the money for the groceries. They have to stay just because he's the head of the household. Are we doing enough to explain to women that they stand on equal footing with men?
Yeah, I think more needs to be done. A lot has been done, as I said, but much more needs to be done because it's the breaking of those cultural norms. Because, as you rightfully said, the woman accepts that the man is supposed to beat me, and the woman accepts that the man is the provider in the home. And I mean, that has changed over the years. We have a lot of women, professional women, who are working. They're very independent. Some of them are making more money than their partners, their male partners. And there is that understanding in the household that even though the woman is making more money than the man, that the man still has his place as the man. So I think a lot more needs to be done in breaking the cultural norms and the habits. I mean, that's a tough one to do, because as you rightfully said, you're born, you're raised in this, you're accustomed to this. And I was just remembering one of the victims of trafficking that I had dealt with, and she came from a situation where her father used to abuse her mother, physically abuse her mother, and she ended up being trafficked for forced labor. And then when she came, she was rescued and everything. And she ended up in a relationship where the male was abusing her. Even though she was rescued, she was rehabilitated. We got her on her foot to earn your own money, start your own business and everything. She ended right back up in a similar situation that her mom was in because that is culturally accepted. And, so to break that and break persons out of that is really a very tough thing to do. It's not impossible, but it's really very tough. And it goes to your self worth. Who are you as a person? Who are you as a woman? How do you value yourself as a woman? And what are your roles and functions as a woman? When God made woman, he took her out of the side of man. He didn't take her out of the back or the spine. He took her, he took a cell out of the side of the man, and that alone says it's figurative to say that the woman and the man play equal roles and have equal responsibilities in a union.
And I think sometimes I wonder too if any attention, when you starve for attention, any attention, you welcome it. And even if it is getting hurt, but someone is looking at you and you're feeling something, even if it's something you have no right as a human being to feel, that attention is it works for some people, maybe because of their upbringing, and that in the Caribbean we're not very I know there's violence everywhere in the world, but let's
Yes.
specifically with the Caribbean, we're not very touchy feely when we're raising our children, the hugs and the kisses and the I love you, we don't do that a lot. And sometimes I wonder whether or not that is related to how willing a lot of women are to accept violence from men. Just to be, I'm in this relationship, I'll get beaten up because, well, I don't want to not be in a relationship.
Yes, correct. You're very correct with what you said. It's spot on. Because the vulnerabilities, as I said, aren't just economic. The vulnerabilities are meeting a need, whatever need that person has in their life. emotional attachment, love, attention, as you say, affection. They probably didn't get it from the home where they grew up and how they grew up, and this person gives them all the attention. And we have something called grooming, which I know your viewers would know about that, the sexual grooming of persons, where it happens a lot online now, and particularly with COVID, that has happened a lot, where you have the persons online targeting persons, and then they deceive them, and then they start to groom them and win them over and woo them. And there's something online called hunting and fishing. And we from the Caribbean, we know what fishing is, right? You throw out the line, you throw out the bait, and you just wait to see if a fish will bite. So that's what predators are doing online now. They're fishing to see who's going to bite. So they put out an ad that they think might attract a particular group of persons, and they wait to see who will respond to that ad. And then you have the hunting, where they aggressively looking for persons online to see who they can go after. And a lot of that has increased, particularly during COVID period. And even now you're seeing cases of violence, not just trafficking in persons, but violence being done. You have cyberbullying, you have all these different types of violence that are taking place online.
Now, in Caribbean governments, this is my final question to you because I know you have to rush off, that we depend a lot on grant funding and those multilateral programs to fund awareness and to create the environment, talk about Spotlight Initiative that will seek to combat gender-based violence. But within our budgets, like for instance in Grenada right now, we're getting ready for our budget in 8 days' time. But it does not have, as I look through it and look through it, I'm not seeing any specific programs being indigenous funding for programs that would address gender-based violence. Do we need to, do our governments also have an attitude towards that issue that is not as enlightened as it should be? After all, our politicians, they come from the same society as everybody else.
Correct. Well, again, as I said, it goes back to male norms, how men see themselves as men in society and how they see masculinity and manhood. But it's important for governments to include that in the budget, because you have to invest in your people, and you have to find ways to reduce the vulnerabilities of your people. Because if you don't reduce those vulnerabilities, then they now become targets and they become prey, and then you have another problem of crimes being committed against persons, and you also have some social issues, which is a very high cost. So it is really better to invest in the person. There are some governments that invest in like if for school dropouts, for example, not everybody is academic and can go through doing SCA exam and GC and all these exams, right? I gave away my age there, but um, yeah. So some persons are good with trade. So the government should have those kind of programs where persons can get involved in a trade and get a profession in a trade or some type of skill, so that they can have a livelihood. Because again, it's all about being independent, financially independent. Whether you're a woman, whether you're a late teenager, even a boy, a young boy and stuff, you need to be financially independent, and also to be able to really take care of yourself so that you will not be vulnerable. I was looking again at the UNODC data, and they said at least 25% of the trafficking in persons cases, most of those survivors were subjected to some type of violence. And the violence could have been they would have been molested as a child sexual abuse, intimate partner abuse. Some intimate partners actually become traffickers, right? And you have what you call the transactional sex, which is where two persons agree that I'm going to have sex with you, and you will provide for my needs. So you will pay my rent, you will pay my bills and stuff, but we have a mutual agreement. That's called transactional sex. And that could transition into exploitation. You have child marriage. Recently in Trinidad, we increased the child marriage age from 12 to 16. But there are some regions where young children are being handed over to men, older men, to marry them, and that older man then takes care of the family, the child's family, right? You also have the
You
physical and the
basically
verbal abuse.
sell your daughter yeah.
You have said, and sons also, with sons, we forget the boys, but a lot of boys, there's a fetish for boys, unfortunately, by men,
In
and
the
there is.
Caribbean.
Yes, yes, you do have a fetish for, And you have, but that aspect, of course, is done on the under the DL. In the DL, it's done in hiding and secret, but it does exist. I remember interviewing a young man in Trinidad who was a university student. I think I mentioned it in the last dialogue I had with you. And this young guy, what they wanted to recruit him to be part of this secret group that was serving high profile persons in society. And he was going to be provided with a car, and he was going to be provided with $5,000 a month. And for a university student, that's a lot of money, just for basically availing himself to persons in high society. And these are women and men in high society. So there is that fetish in the region. And we've seen even persons on the international arena. You've had the Jeffrey Epsteins, you've had the R. Kellys who have been convicted. Well, R. Kelly was convicted. Jeffrey Epstein, he, you know, was killed, right? Was killed or committed suicide.
Well, they say
You have the
suicide.
Ghislaine Maxwell, allegedly, and you have the Ghislaine Maxwells and stuff who target children, men and women. And so you have these terrible vices that feed beyond the stigmatization of masculinity and male and all of that, and male sexual entitlement. Because you also have the initiation of men where they have a teenage boy and they want to initiate the boy to become a man. And so they take him to a brothel, or they take him to have sex with a woman for money. And that is the boy's initiation into manhood. So we have all these cultural norms that are accepted as normal. Then you also have prisoners. There are persons in prison where violence is committed against them, men and women. Right? So this whole violence against is really a very broad issue, and it really needs to be addressed by all governments individually. You mentioned the Spotlight Initiative. The funding has come to an end. I think it's wrapping up in most of the countries. So
It's
then what
wrapping up
happens?
here, yes.
Right. So we depend on these international donors, but really the international donors are not there to finance your country or to finance your government. The international donors are there to support the government in the work that they're doing. So it is now up to the government to take on that responsibility in partnership with other stakeholders, because the spotlight would have involved civil society, private sector, faith-based organizations, and government. So it's not just the government, but it's the country. The country has to take over that responsibility and work together with all of the various stakeholders. I remember back in 2015, when I was at the counter trafficking unit, we had an anti-child trafficking campaign that ran for 6 months from 2015 into 2016. And that campaign was not funded by the government. The campaign was funded by the banking sector, the media. They provided free advertisements and free interviews on television and in newspapers. We had private citizens that came in and funded, and that was like almost $500,000. $500,000 of investment was made into that campaign, and it was just a campaign to raise awareness about child trafficking, right? And so really it's not just to rely, the government of course will endorse those types of projects and programs, but really it is getting the monies, because the private sector does have quite a bit of funding. They have their social programs where they can invest in those things and they get tax rebates for it, right? So there are so many different ways. Churches play a role also, and organizations may not be able to give just money. They can give their time, they can give their skills. So you may have counselors and psychologists that work in the organizations, and they decide to volunteer their skills and volunteer their time. There are some persons who are skilled in financial literacy, and they could teach courses on financial literacy. So really, it's a whole of country. I wouldn't even say government, a whole of
A
country
whole of country
response
approach.
that, yes, that is required. So with the Spotlight Initiative ending, I'm hoping that the governments and the countries will really come up with the best way forward to continue providing the support that is needed to persons who are identified as victims.
All right, I want to thank you so much for joining me on The Narrative. It was a pleasure to have you once again. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me, and do have a Merry Christmas and a wonderful New Year.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is The Narrative. I'm your storyteller, Calistro Fario, speaking there to Alana Wheeler, a consultant who focuses on gender-based violence. And we were speaking there about 16 Days of Activism, the United Nations program that began on November 25th and ends on December 10, International Human Rights Day. More when we come back. All right, just leave the short. Let me do the in.